everyone. I'm Rory McGuire. I'm a professor and extension specialist at Virginia Tech, and I am for the soil because the soil is our future. We don't make any more of it. If you eat, you rely on soil.
Welcome to another episode of For the Soil, a conversation. I'm your host, Jeff Ishii, and we're going to be doing something a little bit different this week. I am taking the week off. This week's podcast will be hosted by Dr. Eric Benfelt with Virginia Cooperative Extension Community Viability, and also Mary Sketch Bryant with the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Eric and Mary will be talking with a man he's been working in the field of soil health for close to 50 years, Mr. Bill Patterson. Hope you enjoy this podcast.
Well, good morning, Bill. We're very pleased to have you on this For the Soil a Conversation podcast. Bill, you've worked with USDA Natural Resource Conservation Service for a long time, and now you're retired but working still as a resource person. If you could tell us a little bit more about your career and your interest in soil health.
Well, my interest started years ago. I actually started with the Soil Conservation Service back in 1974. So next August, I will have been doing this kind of thing for about 50 years. So back in the day, we didn't call it soil health, but it all boiled down to soil health. And of course, back in those days, it was much more technical than it is now. Now it's more money involved. But basically, the gist of what we were doing was providing water, providing rotational grazing, recommendations on rotations and diversity and all that kind of stuff. A lot of the stuff that's sort of buzzwords now we were doing, but like I say, we weren't calling it that.
Bill, how I'd be interested, having been with NRCS and within soil health for decades, how have you seen the technical understanding of the soil change over time?
Well, I think we know a whole lot more now than we did, but I think we still have a whole lot more to learn. And we're learning some of the complexities, and I find it very interesting. Sometimes I think the more we learn, the less we know. But we're seeing things happen that we can't necessarily explain, but we know that it works. We can guess what it is, or we can use good judgment to try to figure out what it is, but it doesn't matter. It works. So just like interjecting livestock into a crop rotation, getting some livestock onto those crop fields. Years ago, we would have never said we'd do that because of compaction and stuff. But now we realize, it actually helps in the long run to have animals on it from time to time. So little simple things.
What do you think is occurring in that situation, Bill, with introducing livestock into cropland?
I personally feel that their hoof action has as much to do with the quality as anything, because it's whatever material is on the ground, those feet are trampling it in, breaking it up, mashing it into the soil, and then those microorganisms much more readily available to them. I'm not positive of that, but that's a big part of it, I think. But we know that it works.
And Bill, through your time with NRCS, have you also seen any change in willingness and the understanding of what's going on in the soil of the clients, the producers, the farmers?
Some of the clients are pretty much like they've always been. They do what their granddaddy did and what their daddy did. But we're seeing a lot of folks that are being much more observant, paying attention to what's going on. And you can ride up and down the road and pick out those farmers because they're paying attention to what's actually happening on the farm, and then they're adjusting to it. And that's 90% of farming is, we've got all kinds of great science, but you have to pay attention to what's going on your farm. and then you have to react one way or the other. That's one of the things that bothers me about a big part of my job is doing grazing plans. And I'm a firm believer that a good farmer cannot have a very strict grazing plan. He has to have an extremely flexible grazing plan. So yeah, this is a good guide, and it's some good information, but we still going to pay attention to what's going on, and then we're going to adjust.
And Bill, during your time, I know you've been a mentor to many people, but then you've also had mentors. If you could speak about people that influenced you early in your career and as your career has progressed.
You know, it's sort of funny. The people that I would consider some of my best mentors were the people that a lot of folks made fun of. I think way back, I'm thinking back in the 70s, 1970s now, Pat True, Fritz Kemp, some of these guys that you've never heard of, introduced me to stuff that I had never heard of. I didn't know what a warm season grass was in 1974, but Pat True said, hey, this is something we need to pay attention to. And here we are now, we're pushing them. I think about a local guy, Bob Horn, Austin Horn's granddaddy, and Doug Horn's father. He's the first one that introduced me to teff, not to teff, but to a trefoil, bird's foot trefoil, and stuff like that. People that they said, oh, well, they don't know what they're talking about. But the biggest one of all has got to be Carl Lubin. There were lots of people that thought he was sort of out on the edge and wasn't. I'm not going to follow too much what he does, but he taught me more about soils, soil health, and what we should be doing than anybody. And he has been a mentor to many folks.
And Bill, I want to jump back to this. I know you have over the years done many a grazing plan, as you talk about. Some of our listeners probably know what a grazing plan is. Some may not. If you could kind of talk about that process, what goes into it, and how are you considering the 4 principles of soil health in making one of those?
Well, I sort of consider it going out and kicking the dirt. They have to have a grazing plan, but the best ones are the ones that say, hey, I need some help. You may not be that much of an expert, but 2 heads are better than one. So come out, look at my farm, walk through my fields, talk to me about what you do know, and then let's try to learn together. But basically, a grazing plan is nothing more than going out, walking the fields, getting an idea of what they've got as far as forage and quality and that kind of thing, and then what kind of livestock they have, and then sort of coming up with, do they have too many animals, which most folks do? Then if they do, what can we do to remedy that? If they're not rotating, we're going to encourage them to rotate, because if you don't change anything else, if you don't do any of the stuff that we throw out as ideas, if you do nothing but rotate, it'll get better. It always does. Then just talk about the principles, diversity. Well, why do I want diversity? Well, you want diversity because you're feeding not only with the animals, but you're feeding the stuff in the soil. And that's feed those animals. We talk about different species, stuff. Sometimes they haven't even heard of them. Anything that we can do to increase diversity, given that grass or that forage a rest time, we talk about those kinds of things. But from the farmer standpoint, the ones that ask the best questions, like we can help the most.
And Bill, speaking about diversity, some of the farmers that I've worked with or visited, they seem to be integrating more, not only livestock, but poultry, sheep, goats. What are you seeing, and what do you see as the benefits of having maybe complementary species in a grazing system?
Well, we don't see a whole lot of diversity in animals. Usually you're either in the sheep business or you're in the goat business or you're in the cattle business. But it does make a difference, primarily because one species will eat stuff that the other one won't and will do well on it, where the other one probably won't eat it at all. So you end up with better plant utilization. Plus, I'm convinced that you don't have near as much weed problems, that kind of thing, whatever you consider a weed. That gets better over time. I think they complement each other.
And Bill, what about, are you seeing integrating livestock into cropping systems at all? I know there's some of that happening around Virginia, but it's maybe still a little novel, what you're seeing there.
I'm not seeing a lot of it. I would say you're right that it is novel, but the ones that are doing it are reaping the rewards of doing it. Hopefully we can spread the word a little better than we've been doing. But some of the folks up in North Dakota and Ohio and other places that have been doing this and are pretty good speakers, they've done a good job of pushing that. And it works.
And Bill, you had spoken a little bit about like warm season grasses, and with thinking about diversity, we often think about not only grasses but legumes and forbs. And what do you like to see as far as diversity in a grazing system? And
with the warm seasons, my experience tells me that they need to be segregated and managed differently because they're an entirely different critter, and they are primarily for a specific job. Their job, in my opinion, typically is to come in there that end of June through August, when the Kentucky 31 fescue is pretty toxic, and we all know that it's toxic. We can get them off of that grass, get them onto something palatable and that does not cause them to have heat stress and that kind of thing. The warm seasons to me are pretty interesting in that if you send them to the lab for an analysis, they don't show that they test that well as far as protein and energy and that kind of thing. But livestock seem to do really well on them during that summer spell that they are loving and the other cool seasons are struggling with. So that's another one of those things that we can't necessarily explain, but we know that it works.
And Bill, I know we're coming up here on the time for this episode, but you talked about the need for flexibility for producers to really just observe their land, be flexible, and specifically look at the context that they grow in. And would be interested, an example of innovation that you've seen recently in your work.
Real recently, you think about the summer of 2023, think about the amount of rain that we had or lack thereof. Farmers had to be flexible. And if they had too many animals, it showed up real quickly. So the person that was stocked well had been doing a good job over time with their soil health and taking care of the forages. They didn't have near the stress that person that had too many animals to start with. They traditionally had too many animals, and it showed up real quickly because they were either buying feed, selling livestock, or in a lot of cases, the livestock were losing body condition because they weren't getting the proper feed. But that's a real recent example.
And Bill, one last question if you would have one resource to share, whether it's a book, a person to talk to, a podcast, or a YouTube video that you'd recommend for folks?
Well, talk about YouTube videos. There's some really good ones. Some of them you have to take with a grain of salt, but anything with Gabe Pent, Dave Brower, they are top notch. They're doing a great job and they don't mind talking about it, but you can learn a lot. But what I've found is if you've got a neighbor that you can ride up and down the road and tell that they're really doing a good job, you can look at their livestock and tell it, and you can look at their grass and tell it. They usually like to talk about what they're doing.
Well, thank you, Bill. We really appreciate your time, and thank you for all that you've shared. Thank you again.
You're welcome.
And that was a wonderful conversation with Mr. Bill Patterson, by the way, who is the recipient of the 2023 Carl Lubin Soil Health and Water Quality Award, presented by Virginia Tech and the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. That award presented at the recent Virginia Farm to Table Conference. And most deserving, Mr. Bill Patterson. What an interesting conversation. For the Soil, a conversation is made possible with funding support from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and the Agua Fund. Other partners include the USDA's Natural Resources Conservation Service, Virginia Cooperative Extension, Virginia State University, Virginia Department of Conservation and Recreation, and partners of the Virginia Soil Health Coalition. Views expressed on this podcast are those of each individual guest. To download a copy of this or any other episode, visit the website forthesoil.org, and if you have a specific question about soil health, call your local extension office, your local USDA Service Center, or a Soil and Water Conservation District office. Music used during today's program was provided courtesy of the Flip Charts, all rights reserved. For the Soil, a conversation is produced by On the Farm Radio in collaboration with Virginia Tech. I'm your host, Jeff Ishii.